Hi, everyone. Thought I'd make something in response to my recent conversation with Paul VanderKlay. I've been really enjoying the ongoing conversation around metamodern spirituality and metamodern Christianity specifically. And wanted to, yeah, maybe just continue this sort of thing of having conversations, responding to them, because a lot of this really directly relates to my own spiritual journey over the past 15 years. And so, yeah, I feel like there's sort of a unique opportunity to offer my own perspective on it to the degree that anyone's interested, which, based on the comments, people might be. I recently broke my hand, and so I can't type out responses to folks' comments in the YouTube comment section. So I thought I would reply to some of them here and just do it that way and see what comes up from that. So here's my response to the response to our conversation that Paul and I had. Uh, so let's see. And last thing I'll say, I guess, is yeah, got a sense that there was a lot of mixed reactions from people, some confusions from people in terms of where I'm coming from and what it is I'm trying to get across. And I thought a lot of that was very understandable. So I thought, why not take an opportunity to try to address some of it directly? And yeah, so here goes. So let's start with let's just go down the list here. A couple of comments I picked out that I thought were might be fun to respond to. User dash YG1DI4UIA1T said, I feel like you guys were talking past each other. Still a great conversation. I feel Paul didn't reveal how he squares the circle about the physical claims the Bible makes and how he accepts those miracles over other traditions other than I'm a Christian, therefore believing Christian miracles just comes naturally to him. However, Paul accepts that miracles can happen while Brendan disqualifies miracles a priori. The problem with Brendan is that he filters out everything that can't be contained by the physicalist frame of modernism. So spirits have a mental component, whether intersubjective or transjective, because part of the essence of this phenomena is mental. It's considered less real or not real at all, an illusion by Brendan's presuppositions. Paul tried to explain that these sorts of phenomena have a reality of their own and actually can govern our actions and have impact in the world, but he failed to give a good enough example. Well, I'll start there, and this will be a running theme. Yeah, my I don't personally operate from a physicalist frame of modernism, um, and so I definitely understand why in our conversation between Paul and I that would come across. The reason for that is because the framing of the conversation I was trying to set up was trying to bring a traditional devotional approach to Christianity into conversation with the modernist frame. So, in a lot of that conversation, I was sort of a stand in for the modernist historical critical lens, which, to be fair, I have a great deal of respect for and feel like needs to be integrated and hence put into dialogue with the traditional devotional lens. But I do not myself consider myself a modernist or work with a physicalist frame. And I'll get into that a little bit more. Some of these words can be kind of tricky, materialist, physicalist, naturalist. There's actually some subtle differences that have very important implications for how we read that. And the other thing I'll just respond to there is the idea of that Brennan disqualifies miracles a priori. Um, mm, I tried to be clear at the end, especially that the way that I see it is that what we think of as miraculous is paradigmatically framed, right? So whatever you think is the kind of intellectual causal framework for reality, that's a certain paradigm. And I try to be clear at the end, especially that the current scientific paradigm is incomplete, and so we don't know what we don't know, and we know that we don't know certain things, and so there's a lot of anomalous information still to account for um, in science. So there can certainly be things that occur that do not accord with our dominant scientific paradigm that needs to be accounted for and currently can't be. So whether we call that a miracle or whether we call that anomalous information, I think is an interesting question because I believe that there are things that happen all the time that don't fit into our paradigm. But rather than, and here's kind of the key point, rather than attribute that to a radically different ontology, and one that maybe comports a lot better with pre-modern religious narratives, I tend to view that as gesturing towards a lot of mysterious phenomena that we currently don't have enough knowledge of to speak to and to incorporate into the paradigm. One of the things, though, about building learning into your worldview is that you recognize that that itself, that the paradigms change, and that learning develops the world model. And so yeah, I just want to make that clear. So Bobby Azarin and I have had a number of conversations about this, mostly in private, but I mostly agree with his perspective, which is that he quotes oh gosh, I forget who said it, but basically the saying, sufficiently advanced technology will appear as magic. And you could say something similar about miracles, that all sorts of things can happen that seem to, quote unquote, break the laws of physics. But what's interesting, though, right, to use that technology example, is that actually they don't. Right, we need to expand our sense of reality, of what is natural, in order to accommodate those anomalous information. And when we do the paradigm shifts, my inclination is that a lot of what, well, how would I say this? That when our paradigm continues to shift, we will continue to integrate and incorporate more anomalous information that has historically been related to religious phenomena that will then become naturalized. And to me, that isn't a disenchanting or depressing thing. It's a rather beautiful thing. Actually, Bobby uses the example. He calls this like Gödel's incompleteness proof for God, right? Which is like you look at what the kind of criteria would be to sort of prove the creator God, right? And you'd have to show a couple things. Well, the universe had a beginning, well, anyway, there's certain kind of setup there. But let's just start there, right? And then for a long time, right, there was sort of a belief in this steady state universe and all this. And then eventually you get, oh, no, actually, we've got like this Big Bang model that needs to be accounted for, and, Doppler redshift and the cosmic microwave background and all this stuff. And then you wind up getting, oh, yeah, there was a beginning to the universe. Isn't that interesting? And so a criterion that you would need to sort of prove God is sort of justified. But the key here is that it's justified naturalistically. So you wind up bringing into reality something that had been supernatural. And his point, which I think is really fascinating, is that this is an ongoing process that keeps developing. And so more and more of what we would sort of expect to gesture towards some kind of grand teleological and theological vision of reality increasingly finds some kind of evidentiary basis, but then it becomes no longer religious, it becomes scientific. So now people talk about the Big Bang in a way that that basically still is very much defined against religious perspectives, but is fully naturalized. And that might be frustrating for religious people because they might feel like the goalpost keeps moving. And I get that. But I would actually kind of present that as something rather beautiful about the nature of reality itself, is that the miraculous continues to be enfolded into the real, so that more and more of reality gets an evidentiary basis for being quote unquote miraculous. I'll come back to this later. Maybe that didn't make any sense, but that tends to be how I view things. So no, I wouldn't say that I count out the idea of quote unquote miracles a priori. I just think that I would classify them differently. Yeah. This person goes on. I think when Brennan critiques religion on having an immoral history, he smuggles in Christian morals in doing so. He's using the Christian yardstick to pronounce a judgment on what is good or evil. It's not Roman paganism, Aztec values, or Mongolian horde morals and ethics he's using. Even Islam believes in the right of conquest, ... So even if Christendom fails by its own metric, it is the metric by which Brennan measures. The sanctity of the weak and the victim is a Christian innovation which is exemplified by the Jesus on the cross. Well, that's a very interesting thought. I'm sympathetic to that reading. I see it rather differently. And this is important too, I suppose, because I think that Christianity was really, really vital and important in the evolution of moral thinking in the Occidental tradition, in terms of the role it played in the West and developing moral sentiments. And in this sense, I kind of totally accept Nietzsche's framing, but I just kind of flip it on its head in the sense of Nietzsche's genealogy of morals more or less accurately traces the evolution of morality and ethics from sort of like an earlier classical pagan sort of yeah, like no ethics of nobility into the Christian morality. And he views this as sort of a devolution, a kind of falling off, a degeneration. And I see it just as the opposite, that actually the Christian tradition was a part of the cultural evolution of the West that honed the West's moral sensitivities. And that was the container in which that happened. I mean, I would posit that other containers might have served maybe not equally as well, but differently. But that was certainly the one that eventually took hold in the Western tradition, and I think it had a very positive impact on the whole. Uh, there's a lot to critique about other things that come out of that, but yeah. So I basically do buy the point that Christian morals continue to be sort of the lens that we assess these things in terms of, or rather, what I would say is the legacy of Christian morality. Because I think what you can carry that genealogy forward and say that, okay, Christian morality then shades into sort of liberal morality as it gets developed in kind of the Enlightenment and into the kind of the early modern and the modern period, which yeah continues the Christian moral tradition, but also continues to expand it, right? So, for example, classically, Christian morality did not include within its scope other religions, right? Like if you were a Muslim, you were a heathen. If you were a pagan, you were a heathen. If you were not Christian, basically, right, you were evil and you were the other, and you should either be converted or destroyed. And that was a lot of sort of the mythos guiding the kind of Christian empires of the time. This is partly why big reason why the religious wars were so destructive. It's because when Christianity itself wound up fissuring, then the other was other Christians, and then there was sort of a civil war in Christendom, which eventually caused people to lose their appetite for the whole thing altogether. But the point being that yeah, other religious traditions were not enfolded into the sort of grand extension of Christian morality, and that itself is actually a development of Christian morality that you see happening in the modern period, and in the growth of sort of Enlightenment morality, which is an outgrowth of Christian morality, but it's an extension, a continuation of it. And so the creation of the secular sphere, the creation of religious pluralism, the ability to kind of have a public sphere in which different religions could be accommodated and respected, and the right to individual religion could be maintained. That's actually a moral. I'm sorry, that's a modern moral. That's a modern moralistic conception that didn't exist in Christian history. And that is again an outgrowth of and an evolution from the Christian tradition, but itself not rooted in my conception, in Christianity per se. Because in order to make that move, you actually have to relativize Christianity as a religion. You actually have to get outside the scope of the Christian religion to accommodate religions as a category, right? So interreligious dialogue, interreligious ecumenical sort of movements have to presume a form of secular modernity in order to operate. And so yeah, so I guess I would just say that there's some truth to that, but I think there's a different way of conceiving it, and in a way that I don't see anything what's the word, sort of internally contradictory about my position, but it's an interesting thing to bring into the mix. All right. Christ us no Christ us totalis, let's say, writes, good interview, good questions, but modernity also proved its own limits. Cantor, actual infinities, and Gödel, what can be true but not provable. something I've been thinking about. Four states of things, names rational and real, rational and unreal, et cetera, et cetera. And I guess I'll just state there briefly in response, yes, modernity did prove its own limits. Um, I'm not a modernist. I'm not, and I'm not even a postmodernist. I'm a metamodernist. Ooh. I wholesale agree with the idea that modernity reached its limits and needed to experience critique and itself needed to bump up against the limitations of its own worldview. But this last thing that this commenter writes is New Testament authors claim more than miracles. They claim Christ is necessary for reality to exist. Hebrews 2:10, quote, for whom and by whom all things exist, end quote. This is an exclusive claim and needs to be thought about on an ontological basis. Forget the distractions and look at the foundation of all things. Yeah, I mean, this becomes hard, right? Because this starts to gesture again towards a certain kind of absolutistic ontological framing of reality through what I interpret as sort of a pre-modern lens. Yes, New Testament authors claim uh, that Christ is necessary for reality to exist. I mean, all right, let's just give you that interpretation. We can work with that, but I guess the question is that how valid a presumption is that? I mean, as I kind of talked about with Paul in our conversation around pluralism, right? Like Muslims claim that Allah is necessary for reality to exist. So the fact that Christians disagree with Muslims, does that mean, like, what does that mean, right? So you need to get outside the scope of internal religious framings of reality in order to assess them. This is sort of a challenge throughout. And so part of what can be frustrating or difficult to try to have these conversations about worldviews is that we're all operating from a worldview. But to varying degrees of self-awareness of that, I guess, right? And so I'll come back to this later too, that it's actually the degree of disembeddedness or decentration that affords new insights into reality based on how far we can disembed ourselves from the presumptions of our worldview. And so, anyway, to assess this claim, I would argue you'd have to step outside the Christian framework to be able to even think about it. But as soon as you've done that, you maybe have negated the thing that you're saying. Hope that makes sense. All right. Christian Baxter underscore YT writes, quote, metamodernity looks like Job, something that Paul said. They go on, modernity looks like most of what you're talking about in your video. I'm not sure who the your is referring to here, but maybe I presume me, because a lot of people think that I'm just a modernist. With due respect, because you have excellent grasp at modern knowledge, but meta-religion looks like Catholics and Baptists calling each other brother without feeling either needs to change church to remain Christian. Yeah, I would agree with that actually very much. A meta religion does look like different religious traditions coming together in a pluralistic way to affirm the brotherhood of humanity, and without trying to get them to convert to their own particular tradition. Part of the little bit of the disconcertion that I feel around this recent rash of conversions, because, for example, in my conversation with Jordan Hall, when we kind of talked about pluralism, his answer to that was that, well, actually, Christianity is more real than these other traditions. It is more right, and if that's going on, it can be it can lead to the kind of exclusionary approaches to religion that you're naming aren't meta-religious or meta-modern. So part of that needs to be precisely what we explore, because as people convert to traditional religions, a lot of the essence of traditional religion is exclusionism and exceptionalism that says we are right and everyone else is wrong. And I would agree that a meta-modern religious approach would not do that. It would be more expansive than that. So how do we make those jive together? Okay. Acuerdox had a couple of things I thought I'd speak to. I'm butchering everyone's handles here, but then again, your handles aren't very legible, so apologies. Acuerdox writes, in movies, when people go kiss the ring on the hand of the king, why would people do that? Do they think that gives them some quality of grace? Is that supernatural thinking? Your frame is very faulty. Those are replying to the relics kissing, I presume. Um, so I guess I'll just reply to that directly. Why would people do that? A lot of reasons. Most directly, I would assume that when the king extends their hand and someone kisses it, that's a sign of obeisance, fealty, that someone is subjected to the power of a monarch. And so they need to humiliate themselves, in the etymological sense, before the ruler. So there's a political reason for that on the one hand. But of course, historically, politics and religion were deeply enmeshed, and so there was the whole sense of the divinity of the king and the monarch. And so, your majesty, your grace, the kind of oblique, direct, how would you say, the oblique speaking to the person of power by means of like the third person as a symbol of like the aura of their grandness. So there's religious intonations to that. There's aesthetic intonations of that. So yeah, there's a lot of reasons why people would do that. I think implicit there is like, should people still do that? Maybe, yeah, like maybe if King Charles wants to knight someone and that's part of the ritual, then as long as it's not how would you say? It's as long as it's not taken to a degree, well, we can come back to this too, but the role that certain rituals play in codifying older forms of power dynamics and relationships, can be held lightly in later years. And I'm not, well, I'll put it this way. I'm not for trying to remove a bunch of traditional and liturgical actions or rites because, oh, this is too problematic or something. I would say this: if someone is kissing the ring of that king because they hold those older pre-modern notions that this is the appointed, the anointed of the divine, and the ultimate ruler, and someone I need to humiliate myself before, yeah, that's kind of problematic. Anyway, so I'm not really sure how all that relates. Anyway, this commentator goes on. You say that you're not convinced by modernity and all that, but really you've both feet on the materialist paradigm. This whole frame here is pure materialism. Think about gravity. How does gravity take action? Where is gravity? Does gravity spend energy? And more importantly, where does gravity get its power? But you know very well that gravity is not a real thing, but a theory. And yet apples keep falling to the ground. And so you end up in this position where you know there's something out there, but it escapes all of your categories. Here, your frame is useless. You keep grabbing onto it, but it turns out it's but a plank of wood in the ocean. You need something better, and it's nothing that you'll find by thinking real hard. The real trial is one of will, not of logic. Well, lots of stuff in there. I won't say what my theory of gravity is because I know that's not really the point here. Again, I would stress I'm not a materialist, despite the claims about me to the contrary in most of these comments. I've written a lot actually about not being a materialist and about the dangers of reductionistic materialism and determinism and the modernistic framework. Again, totally get why people who maybe aren't familiar with the rest of my work would be getting that impression based on my conversation with Paul, because I was trying to home in on that modernist response to traditional devotional approaches to religion in order to grapple with that, which actually might be a good reason to explain why, right? So if there is a pre-modern, modern, postmodern, metamodern, and these things are thought to develop into each other, then it would seem that the growth edge for traditional devotional forms of religiosity would be its confrontation with the modern paradigm. That's sort of what you might call the zone of proximal development, or the adjacent. Well, I don't know if you want to say the adjacent possible, but let's just say the zone of proximal development. Meaning that, yeah, operating from a traditional devotional lens, it might not be the most productive thing to engage with postmodern thought if you haven't fully grappled with the modern thought that's replying to, and in many ways modern just is another term for sort of post-traditional, right? So You can't go post traditional until you've gone post traditional, at least kind of really grappled with that. So, my taking that perspective and lens more or less in an isolated way was an intentional act to try to facilitate specific engagement between the traditional devotional and the modern in order to see, you know, what that looks like and how that moves into new registers. So again, yeah, understood why people might think I'm a materialist, but I'm not. If you're interested in what I am, you can check out my other stuff, and I could provide links or whatever. But that'll probably also become a bit more clear as I go on. Last comment from this commenter. The thing about these endless points of critique is that they apply to science too. You want proof for science? There ain't any. There's no final answer that can finally prove any position for sure. You could throw all of those same things to an old scientist. What are you really grasping for? Um, so this is a a point worth kind of grappling with. On the face of it, I think it's pointing to something true and real, which is that looking for sort of a solid foundation to knowledge is not the right approach. And in fact, that's one of the great failures of modern epistemology, right? The whole foundationalist project, people like Descartes trying to like establish their foundation somewhere, like, you can't doubt this, and then you can build everything up off of that. That is that's a failed project, I think, mostly. And so a lot of the postmodern perspectives critiquing modern science and epistemology more broadly, I think, focus on that. So yeah, I think that's true. And I'm not a foundationalist. There are other ways of thinking about these things, though, right? Like, for example, Jean Piaget talked about the circle of the sciences as something that mutually inform one another. So you actually get a kind of a virtuous epistemic circularity in the sense that, like, mathematics, no, what would you say? Like, I don't know, philosophy informs mathematics, and mathematics informs physics, and physics informs, biology, and but then it all kind of, and then, then you get to culture, and then culture winds up informing philosophy, which informs mathematics and all this stuff. Or that's kind of one way of thinking about it, right? So rather than looking for a foundation, you're actually looking for a kind of self-organizing autocatalytic circle, and to the degree that mathematics is saying something very similar to what we're getting from philosophy, from what we're getting to biology and culture and all these things, that there's a kind of mutual reinforcing that goes on there. But the bigger picture is that you can be more right, I think, in all this. And there's a lot to be said about this. And I'm writing a lot about this at the moment. So I can't get into all this here. But I would basically just say that while there isn't a foundation that you can firmly stand on and say, I don't know, what did Luther say? From here I stand. Here I stand. I can do no other, or that's not quite the right analogy, but there's a sense of like, here I am, and I know this for sure, and I'll build up the whole rest of my system based on this idea. Whether that's the cogito or something else. Yeah, no, it doesn't work. And but what we can do, though, is appreciate that relative to other forms of knowing, some forms of knowing are more accurate, more right. And there are kind of internal logics for how you can assess that. For example, how much of the previous paradigm does the new paradigm account for, right? If the new paradigm accounts for more than the previous paradigm did, and it can actually account for, essentially the older paradigm as a subset of the new paradigm, then you've actually expanded the scope of knowledge. For example, the way that like Newtonian physics becomes basically a subset of like general relativity theory. I guess to bring back the gravity thing here. Right. Newton wasn't wrong so much as he was partially right. And that the advance of knowledge looks like the advance of partial rightness. Anyway, I could say a lot more about this, but it's actually incredibly important. So maybe I should say more about it at some point. But the whole movement from the pre-modern to the modern to the postmodern to the metamodern is conceived in these terms, right? It's not just like, well, you have your worldview and I have mine, and mine's traditional devotional and yours is metamodern, so who cares? The whole claim here that marks the distinct shift from the postmodern relativism is that there actually is an increasing degree of knowledge, and that we are actually genuinely learning things as these worldviews evolve one into the next. And we have to take that very seriously. I think that's very core to metamodern ways of thinking about things. And to justify, again, taking the modernist lens, that role in my conversation with Paul was coming from that position, which is that, well, we can't jump to some kind of, certainly not the absolute, but we can't jump, uh, three steps. Let's just jump to the next step and then get the traditional in dialogue with the modern, with the sense that, to the degree that I can and did in my conversation, support and justify the modern mindset, it's not as a totality, it's as a relative truth compared to the traditional devotional, right? I'm not a modernist. I don't think that the modern historical critical thing captures all the truth. I just think it's more true than the traditional devotional. And so it troubles me when that truth isn't being included in the conversation, not because it's the be all end all, but because it's got more of the picture that needs to be included. The last thing I guess I'll say is not the totality either. People can the the only thing that's absolutely false is absolutes. When people want to make something absolute and say, ah, yes, now we have the historical critical method. This is the way it is. It's like, well, no, that's not the way it is. That's a new way that it is, that we can relate to what it's been. And if it says more, if it teaches us more, if we learn more about reality, then great, we're on the right path. But as soon as you want to make that the ultimate frame, yeah, you've missed the point. So that's kind of the metamodern frame of all this. All right. Mix K1D, Mix Kid wrote, if you are going to live a genuine Christian life, you believe in Jesus is God. If Jesus is God, he's not subject to the laws of the universe, dot, dot, dot. So there would be nothing stopping him ascending into heaven if that were the case, even with our modern understanding of physical laws. He's not the governor of the laws if he can't transcend them. Metamodern Christianity would cease to be Christianity if it could just reimagine core dogmas like this. Yeah, again, I respectfully have a different view of it than that. There's a lot. What you're saying makes logical sense within that framework. And I get it, right? Like, the creator is outside of what he's created. If Jesus is God, then Jesus can do whatever he wants. I mean, you do get into some interesting theological and philosophical questions, right? The classic, like, could God create a stone too big that even God couldn't lift? What do you do with a question like that? And then this is sort of like where a lot of medieval scholasticism ended up, and sort of like, at a certain point, the paradigm kind of gets a little bit too encrusted with like these kinds of confusions and extensions of purely sort of transcendent hypothetical framings of things that explains a little bit why people felt like we were making some profound progress when we sort of shifted out of that mode into something more empirical and things that we could actually test and assess. I don't really know if I have anything else more to say that, other than just that it's a claim that needs, again, to be sort of assessed in a broader context to be made sense of, right? And I always will keep kind of coming back to the religious pluralism question as a way of getting into that, right? Like, again, Allah is like, the thing outside of and the creator of the world in the Muslim context, and then the assessment of why that's wrong and Jesus should be understood as that instead, or why other religious traditions, again, you're going to wind up being led towards using rational argumentation and sort of apologetic reasoning in order to make the case for your religion. But as soon as you've done that, you're now like in the modernist paradigm of using rational arguments. And so as soon as that's the case, like, those lines of argumentation that you've brought up, I'm not sure if they still hold. I'm not sure if I have anything else more to say to that, and there probably could be a lot more said about that. But we'll move on. But anyway, happy to get more into that if people wanted to talk more about that. Vivian B6199 writes, quote, this misuse of the term deconstruction, so flippantly thrown around as if it signifies something interesting or meaningful, makes me cringe. Sorry, another horrible term. Derrida, who coined the term, used it in a very specific and technical manner, i.e., a method of reading texts, literature, and philosophy. He did not mean the ordinary questioning one's faith. There's no need for a new word when talking about a crisis of faith. It doesn't make you seem smarter by saying it is a quote deconstruction. This is the problem, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, that's true. Um, the deconstruction of Derrida and that whole method is not what is sort of presumed when people talk about deconstructing their faith, etc. Uh, I don't know what more to say about that other than just that the same word can mean multiple things, even as it actually even draws on other associations and connotations uh, to do different work. And I can understand your frustration if you're a Derrida scholar and find that a kind of appropriation of a meaningful term in a way that you find adds confusion. And so, yeah, I'm sympathetic to that. At the same time, personally, I find deconstruction to be a valuable idea because it does relate the kind of move towards the consequences of, say, like postmodern deconstruction in that Derrida sense, which is a certain kind of nihilism and a breakdown of meaning, et cetera, et cetera. It relates all of that almost kind of associatively to the kinds of religious framings that people experience and the phenomenological experience that people have when they quote unquote deconstruct their faith. So personally, it doesn't bother me. I think it makes some interesting kinds of connections, but I can understand if you're more of a purist and care for more of the technical rigor of certain terms that would be frustrating. Yeah, sorry. Sorry. It is what it is. But I hear you. I'm not sure what to do about that. William Branch 4283 writes, modernity drives domicide, and domicide is a symptom of the self-destruction of society. Based religion can only slow this process until modernity ends. Winking sad face. Yeah, I would agree that modernity drives domicide 100%. And by domicide, we mean the destruction of home and homes and the nature of the hearth and the home and the center, the traditional, you know, center of the world, essentially. That is the kind of classic critique of its inherently alienating consequences. So 100% on that. And that's one of the big reasons why postmodern critiques can be really important because they foreground that and they look, well, I don't know, do they look for responses or answers? I don't know. At the very least, they present the critique. So saying modernity drives domicide is itself kind of a classic, maybe postmodern expression. And so I think that that's a important thing to add into the mix. The rest, I probably expectedly don't so much agree with. Well, I do agree with domicide is a symptom of the self-destruction of society. Yes, I agree with that too. So the first sentence, totally agree. Second sentence, based religion can only slow this process until modernity ends. I disagree with that. I think that, well, obviously a lot hinges on what you mean by based religion. But my concern is that people understand the critique of modern domicide to necessarily require a the answer lying in basically an anti-modern sentiment, right? Which then draws people back into the traditional devotional lens. And that is precisely what I'm trying to offer an alternative for, because I think that that ultimately is not the way forward. I mean, just to use an example, right? Like technology causes a lot of problems, creates a lot of terrible things in the world. At the same time, if we try to set our goal as stopping technology's advance, I think that that is both doomed to fail and also isn't the right approach. And by the way, I say all this as a recovering ardent reactionary and Luddite. So that's another part of my story that people probably should know a little bit more about before assuming I'm whatever they think I am. I used to live in a kind of reactionary commune of folks who, were ardently anti-technology and always bemoaning the state of society and how ugly everything had become and the uses of technology and the destruction of tradition and the destruction of beauty and culture, et cetera, et cetera. And ultimately, I found that the reactionary attitude that that engendered in me made me very bitter, resentful, rather miserable, and kind of and profoundly misanthropic, profoundly negative about well the future because I thought well we're only going somewhere negative, and very down on the state of humanity in a way that did not actually lead to my flourishing. So if the hope here, if the eschatological vision is quote unquote until modernity ends, that's I guess I'd want to know more what that vision looks like because what does that even mean, right? Um, what does the full recession of modernity look like? Does it look like we don't have medicine or human rights or women's rights or this or that, right? What about the modern world do we actually really like? I mean, there's a obvious, irony, if not performative contradiction, every time we're using things like the internet to communicate our disdain for modernity that hopefully isn't lost on anyone. And none of that's then to say, oh, therefore everything that the internet and the technocrats want to do is right. It's just to say that there is a lot of meaningful stuff also that comes out of modernity. And the whole point of the metamodern thing is not to assert modernity over the traditional always or the postmodern over the modern. It's to say that there are both positive and negative aspects of these different cultural codes, and that we want to optimally integrate all the best of the best and leave the worst of the worst behind. And so, yeah, I wouldn't say that I'm looking forward to the end of modernity, other than as something that we can transcend beyond modernity, right? Like what is on the other side of quote unquote modernity that isn't just going back to a previous way of being. Something, yeah. Um, all right. R, many R's followed by a one writes, speaking of me, his apparent understanding of metamodernism is baffling. He insists that tradition must swallow modernism whole, but his own modernism appears wholly untouched by postmodernism. I believe that this commentator is referring to me in this, though I was a little confused by that because I'm not insisting that tradition must swallow modernism whole. I'm not quite sure what that fully means or how that it was interpreted that I was suggesting that. So I believe that they're talking about me, but I would actually, yeah. So I didn't hear anything in this conversation that I would actually call metamodern, except from Paul. Brennan's thought was barely distinguishable from an old school Enlightenment modern. Really weird project here. Again, yeah, I can kind of understand why people might think that. Again, I hope this clarifies a little bit that what I'm trying to do, what I was trying to do in my conversation with Paul was assume a specific uh, modern historical critical perspective in order to engage the traditional devotional lens specifically. As I said explicitly at one point, I'm not even trying to bring in the postmodern here yet, just trying to focus on that particular dialectic. And down the road, we'll bring in the postmodern, and then eventually we'll, in some capacity, whether I make a specific video on this or whatever, talk about specifically what a metamodern Christianity is. So again, I get it, but yeah, to help clarify for folks, the perspective I was taking in my conversation with Paul is only just a fraction of what I consider to be part of a holistic metamodern perspective. It's just the most adjacent stuff that needs to be dealt with, I feel like, when you're engaging the traditional devotional perspective. As I interpret it, and by the way, that's a critiquable angle, right? Paul might say that he's not traditional devotional, but he's actually metamodern, and so a lot of this also is contesting and negotiating what we mean by metamodern Christianity. That's sort of the whole point, right? So hope that makes sense. They go on. I only hear this fundy level iteration of strong belief in modernist religious assumptions, as opposed to the political non-religion that was differentiated at the beginning of the convo from some very old religion profs, new atheist dead-enders, and the hick lib equivalent of raised as Christians who are trying to make their way in the managerial class. It was quite surprising to hear it from someone in the Vervaeke, etc. constellation. Yeah, again, I mean, hopefully my framing here helps explain that, but maybe it doesn't. So we'll see. I mean, don't get me wrong, I will continue to press the importance of the modern historical critical lens because it's an essential aspect of a metamodern perspective, right? If metamodernism is about the integration, the synthesis, the superposition, whatever you want to call it, between modern, postmodern, pre-modern, that's got to be in there. So this conversation was, specifically about tackling that angle. Yeah, I think I'll just leave it there for now. Interesting comments. Yeah, it's I enjoyed seeing all the reaction and the response, and I appreciated how much enthusiasm and reaction it generated. And then, it's got like 2,000 views at this point, and it's just over a couple of days. So yeah, I want to continue that. This is very alive for folks. This is very alive for me. Something I've been wanting to talk about for a long time. And just, I guess, to offer some final reflections on the whole conversation. Yeah, I can actually. I've heard a few folks express some kind of disappointment that it didn't do a certain thing, and I actually felt that myself. And part of that all is I'll own as my own kind of. There's a limitation in, let's say, trying to double down on that traditional versus modern dialectic, that it's very easy for that just to become a very classic, played out, established groove that ultimately doesn't go anywhere, kind of, familiar impasse and an Ouroboros. So I got a little bit of that from our conversation, and I could see switching gears from that to do something different. I was already trying to switch gears from what I did in my conversation, say, with Jordan Hall, which is basically to not offer any of that into the mix, but to just simply hear Jordan's perspective, and got a lot of positive responses to that conversation, but also felt an internal frustration that we weren't really able to get into some stuff and kind of haggle it out and explore and wrestle with each other and each other's ideas. So I thought that my conversation with Paul might be as a way to test that out. But I would agree, not the optimal dynamic, I think, in what I'm looking for. Metamodern Christianity is not, it needs to transcend the kind of classic, yeah, fundamentalist versus modern debate. And as Paul rightly noted, I think a lot of our conversation was still kind of just circling around those old debates. So yeah, I welcome further thinking, reflections, perspectives on how we could help to move the conversation. I have some ideas for maybe some videos I can do to try to assess some of this and offer some more thoughts about why I think that's happening, and what, yeah, what the dynamic is in a way that could help us kind of move things forward. But I also, want to have more thoughts from other people as well. Anyway, I'll leave it there for now. Thanks for your engagement, everyone. And there will be more on this to come. I will be spending the next at least few weeks really probing into this issue, and depending on where all that goes, maybe much longer. Again, I'm most versed in the Christian tradition. I have a background in biblical studies, and for a lot of my career in the metamodern scene, that stuff has just been on the shelf, because most of the conversation has focused more on Eastern traditions, meditation, maybe some Neoplatonism and stuff. But for the most part, it tended to have a huge influx of sort of integral thought, which is much more influenced by Buddhist and Vedantin, sort of mysticism. And so there wasn't really much opportunity to get into the Judeo-Christian stuff, let alone the kind of historical critical stuff. So this recent God Pivot series of conversions has offered a new opportunity and an urgency, to be frank, about getting into all that. I almost feel like there's kind of a generation of people who, even though they may have, I don't know, circled around, grew up in the shadow of, or maybe totally avoided that fundy versus modern debate. And so it's sort of missing from the vocabulary of folks. And so I feel like there's a certain responsibility to make sure that that's still part of the mix, but not to get stuck there. So that's the challenge largely for me going forward, is to find a way of bringing this stuff into the conversation in a way that doesn't just create a certain kind of impasse or a dead end or oh, here we go again. The last thing I want to do is just come across like another new atheist because I'm not a new atheist, and I think that that whole approach is counterproductive. At the same time, I do think that we have to grapple with the insights of modernity, the insights of naturalism, of science, of modern historiography, and all the implications that that raises for traditional religion. I'm open to and excited about exploring different ways of conceptualizing that impasse and exploring different ontologies and different ways of thinking about how these can sort of pluralistically be held simultaneously, or maybe not, or maybe they're fully developmental and one does just have to fall by the wayside to give birth to another. Really open to the possibilities, and don't want to give people the impression that, yeah, I'm just sort of a kind of absolutistic modernist. Someone called me an ultra modernist in the comments, and I thought that that was just very interesting. Again, based on my history and all the other stuff that I've written. Anyway, here's to more conversation and getting to know each other better across these different communities. Thanks for your engagement, everyone. Godspeed.